Let's go.
Alright guys, hope you enjoyed that intro. That was just some footage I threw together just because I thought it was kind of a cool bobber and egg session. Most of those fish, I think all of them were caught on bobber and eggs actually. So that's what we're going to talk about in this video, is how I set up bobber and eggs. But first, we're going to go to the verse of the day, which I'm going to keep it in one that a lot of people probably have heard, and it's John 3:16. So this is, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life." So because God sent his one and only Son to earth to be crucified on the cross, he saved us so that we could have everlasting life. So I just want you guys all to know that Christ is with us. Christ died to save us, give us this beautiful world that we have to take care of, all these things we get to do, and enjoy the outdoors. It's a beautiful thing. So anyway, if you guys are more interested in the Bible, pick it up, start reading it. You know, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, all good places to start, where Jesus was teaching the disciples how to live and showing us how to live our life on earth as it should be. But anyway, to the video. So I'm going to be showing you guys how to set up bobber and eggs. I'm going to show you two of my favorite ways of doing it. One kind of more of a high water way, the other this low clear water. So in the last video, I did pretty good in low clear water, and I was using the center pin, obviously, which if you don't know, there's a center pin. I know it's a mess right now, but it's basically a free spinning spool, so you control everything that goes on with it. So you get a perfect drift because that spool just spins, that line goes out freely with the current, and you get a perfect drift every time. And when that bobber goes down, as you guys may have seen, you're right there on the reel. You can set the hook immediately and not have to worry about trying to, thumb the reel or click it over or turn the bail over. You're on the reel at all times. So it makes it really, really nice to float fish with. But obviously in that video, the intro clip, I use bait casters a lot. I don't know if there's any spinning reels in there, but I use spinning reels as well. They all work great for float fishing. So the rig that I used in the last one, in that low clear water, was actually a fixed float setup. Now a lot of times low clear water, these fish are very, very spooky. So something like this little tiny fixed float, a couple split shot, really, really help to not spook these fish. And this fixed float, being a balsa, it's a balsa wood fixed float, very, very sensitive, right? A lot of times with a slip float that slides up and down your line, right? A lot of times they're foam or they're like a good plastic, and it actually takes a lot for them to go underwater. That balsa, especially when you weight it up right with all the split shot, so sensitive. Those fish breathe on it and that bobber's going down. Now some of you might be like, well, hang on a second, does that mean you're snagging the fish because it's going to go down? No. They obviously have to grab the bait before it goes down. I was exaggerating when I said they breathe on it. But a lot of times these early Chinook, you got these late August fisheries, early September fisheries, and we haven't really had any rain, water's low and clear, and these fish are very spooky. A lot of times they will come up and just kind of nip at your bait, especially if you're running beads. A lot of guys fish beads. I fish beads a lot this time of year as well. A lot of times they will come up, grab them, and spit them out, and you won't even realize that what just happened, Or if you're using one of these foam bobbers, a slip bobber, a lot of times your bobber would just kind of bobble, and that's it. That was the bite, and it's over. And you would have never thought anything. You thought maybe I hit bottom, maybe I bumped a fish or something, or a fish nipped, but you'd never have a chance of hooking him. With this little balsa float, those fish come up and nip at it like that, that float's going down. So how you set up one of these is, obviously your main line has to be mono. I would not run this on a braid main line. Now you can use a braided main line and run a mono bumper. That's what I like to do if I'm using a bait caster or a spinning rod. But on the center pin, I'm running a 15-pound mono as my main line all the way, so that way I can just run the fixed float right on it. So these take two pieces of little tubing. You slide one on, you hook it onto the float, slide the other one on your line, and then hook it onto the float. And that's what holds your float. But it slides up and down your line. It's not wet right now, so it'll burn up my line and burn up those stops if I slide it, so I'm not going to. But it'll slide up and down that leader, or up and down that main line, excuse me. So then what you do is you have to balance that out with split shot, right? So what I'm doing is this is a 6 gram float, which in the low clear conditions works excellent. When you get into the higher flows, you can use a heavier fixed float, but at that point I like to move to the slip float, which I'll show you next. But in the low clear water, this is a little 6 gram float, which is, gosh, I think like under 1/4 ounce, something like that. I'm probably wrong, but so I run a couple split shot below it, a couple bigger split shot, a little micro swivel. To that micro swivel, I'm gonna tie my leader that has my hook with an egg loop knot. Now, if you want to know how to do the egg loop knot, there's a lot of videos out there. If you want me to do one, comment down below and I'll try to do one for you. It's just really hard for me to film these up close little knots a lot of times, but I'll try to do it if you guys want. But essentially what it is it makes a loop. So you can push your line up and there's a loop. You can put your eggs in and then cinch it tight, and now it's tight around your eggs so it holds them onto the hook. But use that. Now in the low clear water, I was running I think it's a 1/0 hook. Now, if you have heavier flows, a lot of people, especially when bigger Chinook are around, people are going to be running, 20-pound leader or 25-pound leader. In the low clear water with the fixed float, I was running 12 and 15. 15 works as well, but the 12-pound, a lot thinner in diameter, a lot more stealthy. But obviously, if you hook a big 20-pound fish on this leader, you've got to be very careful and you've got to know how to play these fish out. The center pin was a very light setup. It is only rated 6 to 10 pounds, so it's a very light rod, a very noodly rod. So it really, really helps to buffer that light line with having such a light rod. It helps to almost like a rubber band effect because it's such a light rod and has so much bend to it. So it really, really protects that leader from breaking on those bigger fish. So I'm running usually about 3 feet or so of this leader. Then from there, I'm gonna put some split shot on this leader because I have a few split shot, on my main line underneath my float before my swivel, but that's not quite enough to balance that out. So when I tie this leader on here, I'm gonna run maybe another 2 or 3, maybe even more than that split shot in smaller sizes, kind of pattern, call it a shot pattern is what they call it, but kind of taper your way down from bigger split shot on that leader to smaller split shot. And what that does is it helps to keep your bait more in line. It helps to keep that bait in line and balance that float out, make it very sensitive. Obviously, if you put too much split shot, it's going to make that float go under before a fish even bites it. Now, you also have to take in that your eggs are going to weigh some, right? Eggs are pretty heavy, pretty beefy bait, so they will weigh down your float a little bit as well. So you got to kind of keep that in mind when balancing out a float. You've got to take in how much are my eggs going to weigh, how much is my split shot, and you got to learn to balance that out. And it really just takes time on the water and putting it in the water and seeing what balances it out. But you basically want enough split shot, and then that when it's all said and done with your everything set up, split shot your eggs, you toss it in the water. You want the water line to be right in that, almost in that chartreuse there, maybe just below that chartreuse. But it makes these floats so sensitive. When those fish barely come up and kiss that bait, it goes down. So that is the fixed float. Now with the slip float setup, I don't like to use it as much in the low clear water just because it makes so much more noise on the cast. For one, when it hits the water, you've got the big weight here that plumps in the water. It's a much harder cast. And the profile of it, that bobber compared to this fixed float, look at the profiles there. Big difference. And these fish in the low clear water, they see shadows. I've seen these fish move. Your bobber's up here. They see the shadow before the bobber gets to them and they move out of the way. They know what's going on in their surroundings. They've come up these rivers and, they're trying to do everything they can to survive, and they know what's going on around them. So you have to be aware. So those little fixed floats are a lot stealthier. But this is how I rig up the slip float. So you you run your main line, which a lot of times people are running these on a spinning rod or a bait casting rod, and they're using a main line of braided line. That is perfectly fine. You can use braided line, but a lot of times I will run a bumper. So I have my braided line and I'll tie on like a 20 feet of like 15-pound monofilament. You can use fluorocarbon, but fluorocarbon sinks, so it's not going to mend as well. So I like to run like, 15-pound mono attached to that braid. So you run a bobber stop up, which I had some somewhere, but I like to run these little rubber bobber stops. They just come on a little thing and you run your line through them. A little bead, a bobber, which this is a 1/2 ounce float, which is pretty standard for my fall Chinook bobber and egg fishing, unless I'm going to a bigger river where you got to move a bigger bobber. But mostly smaller tributaries, a 1/2 ounce works fine. I have another bead, and then I run a second bobber stop there. That way when I get snagged up, I can't break off that bobber. If that bottom weight does happen to snag and break off, I still save my $10 bobber, because they're pretty expensive and they can be very hard to find. So then under that bobber, I'm running my weight, which my whole thing just slid apart. I had it on a piece of line, but my bobber stop on top just slid off. So my inline weight is going to go below the bobber, and that's going to balance it out. Now, if I want a more sensitive setup, I'm going to match my weight to the bobber accordingly. So this is a 1/2 ounce bobber. This is a 1/2 ounce weight that I have underneath of it, right? And so that's going to put the water line, somewhere right around in there on that bobber. So that's going to be about where you want it, somewhere in there. But then you have to add your eggs, which again are a little bit of weight. And I do, on this one as well, like to run a couple split shot on that leader. Not as many as like the fixed float setup, but from that weight underneath that float, you tie that leader on, and I like to put 1 or maybe 2 split shot on there, just because your eggs are going to be kind of buoyant and they're kind of wash around in the current. So you still want a couple split shot underneath to hold those eggs from washing around too much. So balancing out this float, you have to keep that in mind, that if it says 1/2 ounce and you buy a 1/2 ounce weight, it's probably going to float it pretty low in the water, which is going to do a couple things. One, it's going to make it more sensitive, which is good when they're not biting as good. But then when you get into some heavier flows and you have it too much weighted and you get into some heavier current and heavy boils, it's going to cause your bobber to go under, and it's not even going to be a fish. And that's why when we start getting into the later fall, more rain, heavier flows, I go away from the fixed float. Because same with the fixed float, when the heavy flows come, these little fixed floats can't handle the heavy current, and a lot of times they end up getting washed under with a heavy current, even though there's no fish. So you got to keep that in mind when balancing out one of these slip floats as well. If you put too much weight on it and you're fishing in heavy current, it's going to cause it to go under. But you want to make sure that you have enough weight under it that is keeping your presentation down when those heavier flows do come. So that is hopefully you guys understood, that's kind of my 2 float setups that I like to use for fishing fall Chinook and coho. It's kind of just bobber and eggs, even steelhead. Sometimes in some dirtier water I've caught steelhead just using bobber and eggs. And so that is kind of my setup for bobber and egg fishing. Obviously when the flows do get heavier and I'm running a heavier slip float, you can bump up those leaders. Bump up that shock leader, that bumper, if you're running a bumper with this. Bump that up to 20 pounds or so. And then for that leader, instead of running 12 pound or 15 pound, you could run 20 pound for that leader, or whatever. But you want to make sure you adjust your leaders and your weight accordingly to the conditions, because I see a lot of people out there that don't really understand that, and they're fishing low clear water and they're using a big heavy slip float with a bunch of weight underneath of it. They're casting out there, their bobbers, boom, smacking on the water, and these fish will scatter. I've also seen people, when the flows are really heavy, try to run a little fixed float, and the current's just washing it down the river so fast, your bait's not even ever getting down there to the fish. So really heavier flows, I use a heavier slip float get my gear down there faster in the strike zone. This low clear water, that fixed float, and I bounce it out with a split shot and have that shot line, right? Bigger split shot to smaller split shot, almost all the way down to about a foot above where I'm actually gonna have my eggs. And that keeps everything almost perfectly in line, right in those fish's face. So the fish is sitting there, your bait's coming down, boom, right in their face. So anyway, hopefully you understood that and you learned something. Thanks for watching. More salmon videos coming. I'll see you guys in the next one.